20th century was a time of incredible change, unspeakable horrors, and amazing leaps of scientific discovery. It was a century marked by events that united and divided us, from great feats to great wars, with advancements and setbacks that showed us the power of many, the power of one.
I have a dream.
A century of revolutions, evolutions, and retributions.
You can try.
A century made by conflicts and crimes, inventions and entertainment, politics, protests, discoveries, and disasters.
Oh, humanity.
We will count down the 101 events of the 20th century. Their stories form the tapestry of our history and shape the world in which we live. In this episode,
for Jews, it was the first time in over 2,000 years that they had known sovereignty as their own people living in their own land.
It was inevitable with these large numbers of Japanese troops being stationed and garrisoned around Beijing. There was going to be some kind of a clash.
People's habits were changing. We didn't go out so much. We stayed at home because we liked the entertainment delivered to us.
Introduced to the world as a shy 18-year-old about to marry the heir to the British throne, she was loved by the people and hounded by the media, in life and in death. The press first noticed Diana during a visit to the royal family's Balmoral estate. A shy kindergarten teacher's assistant, catching the eye of the world's most eligible bachelor, seemed to be a fairy tale come true.
The marriage service is planned for St. Paul's Cathedral on the 29th of July, 1981, when Her Majesty's subjects everywhere will join in wishing Lady Diana and the Prince of Wales every happiness in the years ahead.
Taking up royal duties, Diana became famous for her charity work with AIDS victims, children with leukemia, and for the removal of landmines.
I think she was undoubtedly somebody who was charismatic, but she also had a very considerable ability to make you feel that she was genuinely interested in you, and she caught people's imagination.
But while Diana was beloved by the general public, her marriage to Charles was increasingly strained. After their separation, each tried to win public favour, intermediaries giving competing accounts to newspapers. A paparazzi pursuit turned into tragedy as Diana and her companion Dodi Fayed attempted to evade the photographers on the night of the 31st of August, 1997. Just after midnight, the car carrying the pair entered a tunnel near the River Seine at high speed, crashing into a pillar. Dodi Fayed and the car's driver died at the scene. Diana died a few hours later at a nearby hospital. She was 36. When Britain awoke to the news, the nation's outpouring of grief was unprecedented.
It was felt to be so unnecessary, so easily avoidable. And because she was so young, so beautiful, her death seemed the more tragic because it was felt that she had so many years more to go.
In the days and weeks that followed, hundreds of thousands of mourners signed a book of condolence and lay flowers outside Kensington Palace. The Queen and other members of the royal family were heavily criticised for remaining in Balmoral and not joining the nation in shared grief.
We have all been trying in our different ways to cope. It is not easy to express the sense of loss, since the initial shock is often succeeded by a mixture of other feelings.
I don't think she understood initially just how huge that death was in terms of public impact. And for her, her priority was her two dearly loved grandsons who just lost their equally dearly loved mother. And I think she was very clearly distraught for them and focused on that.
Diana's funeral, held at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of September, was attended by 2,000 people, with an estimated 2.5 billion people worldwide watching on television. 20 years after her death, Diana's image is still one of the most recognized in the world, and her memory one of the most cherished. A brand new ship on its maiden voyage. A fateful night at sea, with conditions that were ripe for disaster. A tragedy that would shock the world. In its day, Titanic was the world's largest man-made object, dubbed unsinkable by the international press.
And on this, her maiden voyage, she was unsurpassed and unsinkable.
I'm absolutely certain that the designers and builders of Titanic would never, ever have described her as unsinkable. No ship is unsinkable, even today.
Titanic was ready for her maiden voyage on the 10th of April. She carried 2,223 people.
There was a very wide range of passengers on board Titanic on her maiden voyage. In first class, of course, there were many multimillionaires and rich people, people connected with the White Star Line. Second class were the more ordinary transatlantic passengers. And in third class, or steerage, of course, there were migrant passengers traveling from Europe to start a new life in America.
4 days into the voyage, Captain Edward Smith received reports of icebergs, but maintained speed at around 21 knots, just under top speed.
It was an unusual night on the North Atlantic. It was perfectly still and calm. It was so calm that the seas were even reflecting starlight. That made it very hard to see icebergs or ice sheets ahead of the ship.
At 11:40 p.m. on the 14th of April, a crewman stationed on the lookout spotted an object directly ahead. The first officer ordered the ship's helm to be turned hard to avoid a collision. But a submerged iceberg spar punctured her side, letting in water.
Titanic might have survived if only the first 4 compartments of the ship had been breached. But 6 compartments had been breached, and it was inevitable, therefore, from the very moment of that collision, that Titanic would sink.
Within an hour, lifeboats were launched, but almost half of the available seats were empty.
The seas were calm. It was the most perfect conditions, apart from the intense cold, for the evacuation of the ship.
Titanic carried 3,500 lifebelts and 48 life rings. But given the extreme cold of the water, the majority of those in the sea froze to death before rescue arrived. Titanic's distress signal was picked up by the Carpathia, which arrived 2 hours after the ship sunk. Survivors were taken to New York. Only 703 people survived. News of the disaster was transmitted around the world.
Titanic was the biggest passenger ship in the world. Size meant everything to people's perception of safety. People's faith in large ships was diminished greatly by that particular event, and it's never been forgotten. It was in many ways a pivotal event in the design of passenger ships and the systems which governed safety of life at sea.
Titanic's final resting place remained a mystery until September 1985. The joint French-American expedition located the wreck, and for the first time in 73 years, the world saw the final resting place of the mighty but tragic Titanic. By 1931, Japan had successfully expanded their empire into Korea, Taiwan, and the northeastern Chinese region of Manchuria. Then in 1937, Japan would turn their sights to the rest of China.
It's worse than frayed tempers in China. It's war.
The Lugao Bridge, southwest of Beijing, was described in his journals by Marco Polo. History knows it as the Marco Polo Bridge. An incident there brought the two countries into conflict.
The pretext was basically that the Japanese had already established their right to rule over the northeast of China. They had been making moves into Hebei and the area around Beijing for many months and been putting more and more restrictions on the nationalist government. Chinese nationalism was rising, so it was inevitable with these large numbers of Japanese troops being stationed and garrisoned around Beijing, there was going to be some kind of a clash.
Japanese forces demanded entry into the nearby town of Wanping to search for one of their own, who was missing. They were refused and shots were fired, beginning a conflict that lasted 8 years.
China, you could argue, needed another 10 years before they were ready to fight this highly mechanized Japanese army. Don't forget also that there was a Japanese Navy which they had to go toe-to-toe with, and the Japanese Air Force. So ultimately, it was too much pressure for them. They never totally buckled, of course, they never surrendered, and they put up an extremely hard fight.
Amazingly to the Japanese, the Chinese show not only prolonged powers of resistance, but the ability to fight.
The unexpected difficulty sucked more and more Japanese resources and manpower into what became a brutal war.
And it's not simply Japanese soldiers coming in and butchering civilians or engaging in rape as an act of war or a weapon of war. I mean, it's much worse than that in the sense of scale and scope, because there were large numbers of population that had to move. The Chinese Nationalist Army blew up a series of dams and dikes on the Yellow River, which forced people to move, to die of starvation, disease.
War still falls hardest on women and children. The youngsters suffer and wonder what it's all about.
The Japanese advanced despite the obstacles, but eventually the Chinese managed to draw together against the foreign invader.
To suffer, to endure, and at last to conquer. That most surely is China's destiny.
As a frustrated Japan enlarged the war, the Sino-Japanese War became part of the Second World War and would end, as did the global conflict, with Japan's unconditional surrender. With peace in 1945 came a resumption of civil war in China, which ended when in 1949, Mao Zedong declared the People's Republic.
There are very palpable remnants of the impact in our day, but in terms of the following 10 years after the war, I mean, the geopolitical structure changes, doesn't it? You saw how the war of resistance, the war against Japan, ultimately, on the one hand, strengthened the Nationalist Party in Chiang Kai-shek. He became this avatar of the Chinese nation, but the war went on for so long, they became so dependent on American aid that it ultimately hollowed out their capacity to govern.
To the invaders, this was a failed attempt at an empire. But to the Chinese, this was the foundation story of New China. The 20th century began with a love affair with the incredible magic of moving pictures. But this revolutionary technology would be changed forever with the addition of one very special ingredient, the human voice.
Right, action.
Bless my soul, there's a lot of talk just now about the old films of 40 years ago. And those are days I remember well.
Ever since the inception of cinema, people had kind of experimented with sounds, and the early sound films were kind of envisaged not to have that kind of synchronized sound in terms of human voices. It was more about, you know, the idea of having a musical soundtrack and sound effects.
In the mid-20s, Warner Brothers bought a new sound technology, but at the time, they had no idea of its capability.
They didn't have their own theatres at the time, so they wanted to experiment with something new that might give them an edge over the other studios, which is when they signed the contract with Western Electric and christened the Vitaphone sound system.
Why, Muty, I'm a new man. Haven't you heard about the wonderful thing Dr. Weston did for me? He pepped up my pulse, gave me a set of vocal cords.
In 1927, the new film The Jazz Singer experimented with music and with dialogue between songs, heralding the first talkie and the end of the silent film era.
The Jazz Singer was incredibly successful. I don't even think we can gauge these days as to how revolutionary The Jazz Singer was.
But the dialogue amounted to 354 words in total. It delighted its audience.
But it was Al Jolson who had first cracked things wide open for the new sound movies when he starred in The Jazz Singer.
Make you wait. Baby, I'm coming. Oh, God, I hope I'm not late.
Now that movies had sound, things changed. From the way they were produced and shown, to the people who appeared in them.
It would cause, massive issues in terms of the actors because they needed to, train actors in terms of speaking and learning dialogue.
The Jazz Singer's influence has reached far and wide. In 1996, the original film was recognized by the American National Film Registry as a cultural, historical, and aesthetically significant motion picture.
The biggest name on the marquees was sound, and it sold tickets as never before. The public loved it.
If The Jazz Singer hadn't been popular, and if it hadn't worked, and if people hadn't loved it, none of the rest of it would have happened. Technology wouldn't have propelled forward, and it wouldn't have developed to accommodate all of the wonderful films that we've seen since the 1920s.
I'd walk a million miles for one of your smiles, but
A fight for independence and the instability that followed would leave a country in Southeast Asia at the front line of the Cold War, a battleground for an America that feared the spread of communism through Asia. In 1954, Vietnamese nationalists drove French colonialists out of northern Vietnam, leaving behind a country divided.
Their departure left northern Vietnam in communist control.
As it were, a number of decisions that lead up to the final commitment of ground troops in 1965. The Americans had aided the French colonialists in Vietnam, and then when the French left, they gave aid and some advice to the government in South Vietnam. However, nothing seemed to do very much good. And by 1964, 1965, the administration of Lyndon Johnson was really confronting a fork in the road. Do you give up? Or do you go in still further with ground troops? And that's the decision that Lyndon Johnson ended up making.
Arriving in Vietnam, American troops were not ready for guerrilla warfare. Tens of thousands died. And after the war, many became addicted to drugs and many suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. In the United States, the public was watching the war on television. Images that swayed public opinion.
There's already a strong pacifist movement in the United States that had emerged out of concerns about nuclear weapons. And we certainly see in the spring of 1965, you see very early on forms of protest and dissent, organized protests.
Tragically, our nation's leadership, while striving for peace, has adopted a course that makes real peace unlikely.
Johnson, many think because of the burden of war, refused to run for a second term.
I wish I could have brought you too some sign that the struggle that you're in will soon be over.
The new president, Richard Nixon, began to withdraw troops from Vietnam in monthly increments during 1969, training South Vietnamese troops to continue the fight without them. The length of the war and the television coverage contributed to uneasiness in America as they began to question whether they should be involved in a foreign conflict.
The legacy of the war in Vietnam, in a sense, derives from the fact that Americans couldn't agree about how it should be fought in the first place. There were people who believed that the war was a terrible mistake and should never have been fought, and there were people who believed that it was justified. And that had implications subsequently for American foreign policy. Did you take the view that Vietnam was an indication that America had become too interventionist in the world and should, as it were, dial back on its military engagements? Or did you take the view that the United States should continue to act against communism where it saw it as a threat in the world? And in a way, the gap between those two parties was very much widened as a result of the Vietnam War. It was difficult after Vietnam to find a kind of consensus point between those two.
After the First World War, the League of Nations was established to prevent another world war. When they failed in this task, they would be dissolved to make way for a new international body, the United Nations. The draft UN Charter had been prepared by a 44-nation committee of jurists meeting in Washington in April 1945.
In the Opera House, Lord Halifax called for a standing vote on the completed charter.
China, as the first victim of aggression by an Axis power, was given the honour of being the first to sign the charter. In January 1946, the first General Assembly of the United Nations, comprising 51 nations, gathered at Westminster Central Hall in London, England.
The UN was set up to prevent a third world war. The powers in Europe were getting frustrated with being unable to get drawn into entanglement into major conflicts, which the costs were higher than the benefits. So no power really wanted to avoid using force to advance their own interests, but none of them really wanted the other powers to be able to do the same. And so the idea behind international peace was becoming increasingly important, valuable, and appreciated.
An administrative compromise that the organisation has often faced is the veto power that was granted to the 5 permanent members of the Security Council: the United States of America, China, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. Rivalry between the great powers often prevented the effective conduct of affairs.
The Security Council of the United Nations is now facing its greatest test, the question of the Berlin dispute between Russia and the Western powers.
But although the UN has fallen short of many of its objectives, it has contributed to real change. At least 90 million young lives have been saved through UNICEF, the UN's International Children's Emergency Fund. Through the World Health Organization, the UN eradicated smallpox, an infection that killed 3 in every 10 and left many blind.
Last year, in October, the Somalia Smallpox Eradication Program recorded the last known case of smallpox in the world.
The UN was also responsible for the Montreal Protocol, which pledged to reduce chemicals that were destroying the ozone layer, ultimately protecting it from further deterioration. The organisation continues to create a link between nations, providing a basis for cooperative response to world issues.
Throughout the 20th century, we experienced seismic shifts, like, for example, the Cold War, that necessitated great flexibility on the part of the UN. And sometimes the UN was successful, other times it wasn't. But the main, maybe characteristic of the UN work during the 20th century was that it was mostly reactive. Instead of being preemptive or preventative, it was following events rather than going ahead of them.
Despite its shortcomings, the UN continues its work into the new millennium, fighting the spread of AIDS, poverty, civil war, and refugee numbers.
The 20th century was by far the most violent century, but towards the end you could see some progress, some improvement in certain areas, and I think that peace was not only preventing war, but also required dealing with the underlying causes of violence and creating the conditions that would allow a more sustainable peace, which is often also a more just peace.
By the end of the 20th century, UN membership had grown to almost 4 times the number of those founding members who gathered. On an extremely cold morning in 1986, the world watched in horror as dreams of civilian travel into space ended in disaster. After decades of blasting into space with one-use-only rockets, NASA's Space Shuttle program was an important step towards greater space travel.
A reusable space vehicle known as a space shuttle, a cross between an aeroplane and a spaceship.
They were certainly an innovative technology. However, compared with the Apollo missions to the moon, the shuttles were really just a taxi into low Earth orbit.
Challenger, part of this new generation of space travel, was launched in 1983.
This was the 25th shuttle mission, and in many ways, many Americans have got very used to watching shuttle launches. And indeed, the major networks were not showing the launch of this mission live. However, there was some public interest, partly because NASA had embarked on a competition to find a teacher in space.
The teacher who will be going into space, Krista McAuliffe. Where's that you?
And she was going to fly on this mission, and once she got up into space, she was going to be delivering 2 classes, which would be broadcast live to school children. And so that was a point of real interest for a lot of people, the fact that this was the first sort of private citizen in space.
The crew put on their suits and prepared for launch on the 28th of January, 1986.
There were 2 main concerns on the morning of the launch. The first was the question of ice. There was a lot of ice hanging down from places in the launch pad, and there was a concern that the ice might break off and damage the thermal protection shield around Challenger. The second concern was with what are called the O-ring seals, which are around solid rocket boosters. The concern was that these O-ring seals would not work properly at low temperatures.
At 11 a.m., NASA's engineers gave the all clear.
NASA allowed the launch to go ahead. It regarded the dangers of an ice strike and leakages from the O-ring seals as being an acceptable flight risk.
Countdown commenced, and at 11:39 a.m., Challenger was in the air and gaining speed.
Of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
73 seconds after launch, there's a sudden bloom and the shuttle disintegrated as a result of the abnormal aerodynamic forces acting upon it. It's not at that moment, we think, that the crew died. The crew cabin continued to kind of arc up and then down, and it's the impact with the ocean that led to the crew being killed.
Experts believe the crew was alive until the wreckage hit the Atlantic Ocean at more than 321 kilometers an hour. A 3-year investigation found structural flaws and weaknesses in the shuttle had been ignored by NASA leaders. The program was suspended during the investigation and was not resumed until 1989.
We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God.
When a man who had never held political office was appointed Chancellor of Germany, it was set the country on a path of war and devastation, the likes of which had never been seen before. Once made Chancellor, Adolf Hitler and the party he led had control. National Socialism became the only permitted political movement. Although Germany had been through terrible trials since her defeat in the First World War, the worst seemed to be over. The economy was showing signs of improvement. And the difficult experiment with democracy, a form of government that Germany had never known, seemed to be working. Of course, a working democracy had never been on Hitler's agenda.
Hitler's intention in the early 1920s was to take power by force, and he was very much led by the belief that actually a march on Berlin by right-wing elements determined to overturn the injustices of the Versailles Settlement would very likely lead to the chance of the Nazi Party getting into power.
The 1923 Beer Hall Putsch, a power grab that landed Hitler in jail, convinced him that power in Germany had to be taken politically and not by armed coup. 10 years after the humiliation of the Putsch, he was invited to become Chancellor. Hitler had campaigned energetically, pioneered the use of air travel to crisscross the country, delivering thousands of speeches, and had reached the position where he seemed, to the powerful elite, a solution to their problem. The elite was headed by an aged president, Hindenburg, who had taken to ruling by executive decree and his appointees.
Hindenburg agreed to make Hitler chancellor because he'd been convinced by one of his former chancellors, von Papen, that this was the best way to handle Hitler. And if you bring him into government, you can tame him and you can control him. So that was the plan. Of course, the plan doesn't work out like that.
The Nazi leader poses with his cabinet, which includes von Papen, seated on his left.
1 month after being sworn in as Chancellor, a young communist burnt down the Reichstag. Here was the reason for demanding emergency powers in the parliament to match those that the stormtroopers could seize in the streets.
Hitler consolidates power after becoming Chancellor by using his usual methods, which was the carrot and the stick. The stick was the threat of force. He still had a lot of stormtroopers on the streets, creating a kind of aggressive movement, a feeling that if people didn't kowtow to the Nazis, they were going to use force. But he directly convinced people within Parliament to vote him enabling powers, which ultimately allowed him to operate as a dictator.
From across the way, Hitler appears at his window, and another milestone is marked in Germany's political history.
The powers are in place, and as Chancellor, Adolf Hitler was in place. So when President Hindenburg died in 1934, Hitler maneuvered with ease to combine the powers of Chancellor and President in a single role, Führer. All opposition was banned. Opponents were imprisoned or murdered or transported to camps.
The impact of Hitler becoming Chancellor in the short term was that he consolidated power in Germany and really then was in a position to set foreign policy on his own. And that ultimately led to the outbreak of the Second World War and ultimately the death of 50 million people.
It has been described as the idiot box, the opiate of the masses, or alternatively, as the greatest communication revolution the world has known, an invention that brought a world of moving pictures into our living room.
Metal fingers beckoning to the invisible, calling to sound the ear cannot hear, and sight beyond the range of the unaided eye. Our era, the era of television.
First thought of as radio with pictures, television wasn't an invention dreamed up by only one person.
In the 1920s and up through the 1930s, there were basically two types of television systems that were living side by side in coexistence and in competition. On the one hand, you had largely mechanical models. These were using a spinning nip-cow disc system of spiral holes in a disc to scan an image.
21-year-old Philo Farnsworth made a technological leap from the early televisions when he developed the dissector tube on the 7th of September 1927, the base for all electronic televisions to come.
These two systems lived side by side right up until the end of the 30s when the last of the mechanical television broadcasts in the United States ended.
RCA discarded the mechanical spinning disc and soon doubled, tripled, then tripled again the scanning lines.
At the end of the 1950s, 9 out of 10 people had at least one television set. People's habits were changing as a result. We were changing as a result of television. We didn't go out so much. We stayed at home because we liked the entertainment delivered to us. What started out as appearing to be something that would just fizzle out within 10 years turned out to be arguably the most important invention this side of the internal combustion engine of the century.
By 1946, around 8,000 US homes had TV sets. That skyrocketed to 45.7 million by 1960 as costs dropped and programming became more sophisticated. The golden age of broadcast television in the US created a cultural juggernaut, spreading American influence to the farthest corners of the world, making television one of the country's most lucrative exports.
Television, for the first time, really created a world system in which a far-off event, somewhere else, far away from you, was something that you could experience and live in a kind of a visceral way.
It's one small step for man.
Scripted programming, sports, news, and current affairs broadcasting flooded the airwaves.
War was brought into people's living room via the television in the Vietnam War for the first time, for example. Disasters, droughts, famines could be experienced by people that had never seen anything like that because it wasn't part of their firsthand experience. And I think that sort of creation of a worldwide lived experience mediated through the television is probably the largest influence that television has had.
And all this has been just the beginning.
One of the important aspects of television that's often overlooked is that it started our love affair with screens. Now, people are going to argue, hang on, we had movie screens before that. Yes, of course we did. But the idea of having a screen right there in the corner of the room that you could switch on pretty much after you got up in the morning and watch as you were having breakfast, and all day if you wished, and certainly throughout the evenings before you went to bed. We love screens, in other words, and as I say, the love affair started with TV.
The dream of the re-establishment of a Jewish nation in the biblical Holy Land. A political movement that began late in the 19th century, but would take until halfway through the 20th to be realized. With the collapse of the Ottoman Empire following the First World War, Jewish and Arab communities who had lived side by side for centuries were now in opposition over who would form the government of Palestine.
After World War I, the British Empire, as part of the mandate system, took control of Palestine under their own mandate.
In 1917, Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, had written to Lord Rothschild. The letter, known to history as the Balfour Declaration, said that Britain viewed with favour a national home for the Jewish people. At the time of the declaration, less than 10% of the region's population was Jewish. But a steady trickle of immigration, many escaping the anti-Semitism of Russia and Eastern Europe, boosted this number over the coming decades. As a result, Arab communities began to see Jewish migration as European cultural colonialism, and the two groups clashed violently throughout the 20s and 30s. The Holocaust changed everything. Hundreds of thousands of displaced Jews were in camps and, as the world discovered, millions have been murdered. Sentiment and sympathy was on the side of the Zionist cause, as thousands of Jews tried to reach Palestine by ship.
After being intercepted by the Navy, the illegal immigrant ship Exodus 1947 entered Haifa harbor under escort. But now she had on board some 5,000 Jews who'd hoped to enter Palestine illegally. Obviously, the need for a decision on the Palestine problem grows more urgent with every fresh incident.
Certainly, the war was a complicating factor for both Palestinian and Jewish communities' relationship with the British regime, who were both trying to throw off what they perceived as the colonial shackles of the mandate. But the war was also a very tenuous time in the Middle East, and many feared for the future of their national project and really their own safety during this period.
As the refugee crisis grew worse, Britain turned the problem over to the United Nations, which in November 1947 voted to split the land into two countries, Israel and Palestine.
Palestine's case is before the World Parliament as Arab delegates look on stonily.
Partition had been a plan that had been pursued many times in the very early history of the emerging conflict between what would then be Israelis and Palestinians in the region. It had returned to at the end of the Second World War, when Britain had decided that it was going to abandon its mandate in Palestine. It was no longer of strategic or political interest to the British government, and there needed to be a kind of political plan put in place to reconcile, or at least what they had hoped at the time, to reconcile these two populations that were locked in a nationalist struggle.
The Jewish leadership accepted the UN resolution, but the Arabs rejected it. The British mandate over Palestine officially ended at midnight, May 14, 1948.
For Jews, it was the first time in over 2,000 years that they had known sovereignty as their own people living in their own land. It was certainly a pivotal moment in Jewish history. For the Palestinians, it was certainly a moment that has had a profound impact on the pursuit of Palestinian national identity.
With the relinquishing of the British mandate, Palestine is rocked by full-scale war, and both sides mobilize.
I think the long-term effects of the creation of the State of Israel has been an ensuing conflict between Israelis and Palestinians that doesn't seem to look to be resolved anytime soon. This was not a preordained outcome of the founding of the State of Israel, and certainly does not remain one today. How this conflict will be resolved, if it is resolved in the future, will certainly, affect the history and politics of the region for many decades to come.
Product of the swinging 60s, tool of free love, liberator of women. No matter which way you look at it, this was one of the most significant medical advances of the century, giving half of the world's population control over their bodies. American activist Margaret Sanger coined the term birth control in 1914, advocating for sex education and safe contraceptive options.
Going back to the 1910s, 1920s, Sanger was a really prominent figure in both educating the public on contraceptive methods that were available, but also trying to make these methods become more widely used and more widely accepted and seen as almost a moral imperative rather than something that was a little bit seedy and immoral.
She believed that women needed birth control to manage their lives. They needed it to control their health, they needed it to be able to work, they needed it to be able to properly look after their families. She was appalled by the fatality rates of the illegal abortions that were going on because women had no choice, and she felt that the way to overcome that was through birth control, and she fought adamantly for that.
At a chance meeting with endocrinologist Gregory Pincus in 1951, Sanger, now in her 80s, convinced him to work on a birth control pill. Initial tests on 50 Massachusetts women in 1954 were followed by large-scale clinical trials conducted in Puerto Rico. In 1957, the US Federal Drug Authority approved the first oral pill, but only for severe menstrual conditions, not as a contraceptive. By 1960, it had been approved for contraceptive use, and within 2 years was being used by 1.2 million American women.
What you have there in terms of Western societies is a total revolution in how women viewed themselves.
When first introduced into the United Kingdom in 1961, the pill was only available to married women. That changed in 1967 when it became available to any woman who wanted it.
Instead of using condoms or something, birth control pill is just something so steady, so sure, gives pretty much the woman control over the situation.
It's meant that women haven't had to interrupt their sexual and romantic relationships if they want to be successful in their careers. However, the thing I think it's important to remember is that none of these changes really could have happened if it hadn't been for the feminist movement of the 1960s and 1970s. Social changes to do with women's status in society, cultural norms surrounding sexuality had already started to change before the pill became available. So essentially it was these changes that allowed women to use the pill as a means for liberation.
Surveys that show that countries where there is effective birth control, that women are more highly educated, they're more involved in a wider range of employment. So I think it gave women a chance to determine their own destiny, and they took it.
In 1994, the murder of 2 people would lead to the arrest and a trial that will play out in headlines across the globe.
At this time, do you wish to enter a plea guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
Orenthal James, or OJ Simpson's sporting prowess, had earned him wealth, fame, and entry into a new social circle. A trajectory that brought him to an ill-fated marriage to Nicole Brown Simpson that ended in 1992. Then on the 13th of June 1994, Nicole and her friend Ron Goldman were found murdered at Nicole's home in Los Angeles.
The bodies were found at Nicole's home, and there was blood in evidence. and OJ was arrested because he had been there, but then released without charge. And then 3 days later, the story goes that he was alerted to the fact that he would be arrested by one of his lawyers.
The information that OJ may be arrested for murder made him panic. He fled his mansion with a disguise and a gun.
Longtime friend Al Cowlings was behind the wheel. Simpson was in the back seat.
At some point, rationality kicked in, and he realized that the only reasonable thing to do was to return home and turn himself in, which is exactly what he did.
The case divided the nation. On the one hand, OJ's blood and gloves were at the scene of his wife's murder. On the other, it had been investigated by the police, who had a reputation for racism.
I mean, you had a black man accused of murdering a white woman in America at a very delicate stage in history. And don't forget, the afterglow of the earlier riots of 1991 was still there, and the race issue was still fresh in people's minds.
Pray for OJ. This is day number 2.
OJ's defense team questioned every move the prosecution made.
And so we are now embarked upon this search for justice, this search for truth, this search for the facts.
The prosecution focused on the DNA evidence.
And when you see the evidence, and when you hear the witnesses, and when you put it all together and consider the totality of circumstances in this case, the evidence will show that the answer to the question is yes. OJ Simpson murdered Nicole Brown and Ronald Goldman.
What happened during the trial itself was extremely interesting, but unfortunate for the prosecution, because they had what potentially was the most damning piece of evidence in the blood-stained gloves. And Christopher Darden, one of the district attorneys who was prosecuting, insisted that OJ tried on the gloves. And that was a fateful error because they didn't fit.
The day Mr. Darden asked Mr. Simpson to try on those gloves, and the gloves didn't fit, remember these words: if it doesn't fit, you must acquit.
OJ Simpson was found not guilty on October 3rd, 1995.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder.
150 million people watched the televised trial, anxious to see the evidence for themselves. In the aftermath of the criminal trial, the family of the second victim, Ron Goldman, launched civil proceedings against Simpson, charging him with wrongful death. The jury at this trial found OJ Simpson personally liable for the 2 deaths. Although OJ was acquitted of murder, public interest and views on the case continue to the present day.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
War was raging across Europe and in China, but the US had avoided direct involvement. In July 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt decided to stop all American oil and steel shipments to Japan in order to halt her military expansion into East Asia. Japan was dependent on these imports as she lacked natural resources in her islands and decided to take action.
It was intending to launch an invasion of British and Dutch colonial possessions in Southeast Asia, and it felt that if it didn't knock out the US Pacific Fleet, that Pacific Fleet would intervene. It also felt that it was very likely that the US would declare war, and therefore why not attack them before there's a state of war, because they would be in a position to guard against a sudden attack like this.
At 7:55 a.m. on the 7th of December 1941, 183 aircraft of the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii.
Not in a million years were they expecting a sudden attack on US territory, on the islands at Hawaii, and on their Pacific fleet, which was in harbor there. And of course, if they had been expecting an attack, the defenses would very much have been on the alert, which they were not.
Within 2 hours, 18 US warships have been sunk or damaged, 188 aircraft destroyed, and 2,403 American servicemen and women were killed.
The whole world knows now how Japan assaulted the American naval base without warning, without a declaration of war, and while her envoys were actually negotiating in Washington.
The Japanese achieved some of their objectives at Pearl Harbor in the sense that they pretty much knocked out the battleship fleet of the US Navy. The problem for the Japanese is that none of the US aircraft carriers were at Pearl Harbor. And what nobody realized at the time, but they would soon discover, was that aircraft carriers were actually the key to ocean fighting, to naval fighting from this point onward.
The day after the attack, President Roosevelt delivered a speech to Congress, condemning the attack and committing the US to war with Japan.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Well, the direct impact of the US entry into the war was interesting because, of course, their immediate reaction was to declare war on Japan, but not on Germany and Italy. What happened next is that Germany and Italy declared war on the US, and there's this great what if in the minds of historians that if they hadn't, would the United States have done the same? In other words, would the United States have simply been fighting a war against Japan, and therefore, arguably, no ultimate Allied success against Germany?